The B-17 flying fortress named Memphis Belle II was 3 minutes from ditching into the North Sea when Staff Sergeant Frank Kowalski pulled a bent coat hanger from his footlocker, straightened it with his boot heel against the freezing metal floor, and told his pilot to give him 60 seconds before bailing out. What happened next would seem too absurd to include in a Hollywood script. A 19-year-old farm kid from Nebraska, using a piece of wire that cost less than a nickel, solved a problem that had killed 127 airmen, stumped 3 teams of MIT engineers, and forced the Army Air Corps to ground 40% of its heavy bomber fleet in the European theater. By the time Kowalski climbed out of that crippled aircraft at RAF Bassingbourn on the morning of March 14, 1944, he had accidentally invented a field repair technique so effective that it would be taught at every airbase from England to the Pacific, save an estimated 300 aircraft over the next 14 months, and remain in modified form as official Air Force emergency protocol until the retirement of the last B-52H in 2023. The problem had started appearing in late 1943, though no one recognized it as a pattern at first. B-17 crews returning from raids over Germany reported a terrifying and seemingly random failure. Their hydraulic systems would work perfectly throughout the mission, through flak fields and fighter attacks, only to fail completely during final approach to their home airfields. Pilots would find themselves wrestling 65,000-pound aircraft to the ground with no hydraulic assist for brakes, flaps, or landing gear extension. Some made it. Most didn't. The crashes were spectacular and deadly, often igniting fuel tanks that had somehow survived combat over Berlin or Hamburg. By January 1944, the problem had claimed 18 aircraft and their crews. The Pentagon sent engineers. They inspected every hydraulic line, every pump, every fitting. They found nothing wrong. The failures continued, now averaging 2 per week. Theories multiplied. German sabotage of replacement parts, metal fatigue from cold weather operations, even speculation about a new German weapon that could somehow disable hydraulic systems remotely. 3 separate teams of specialists from MIT, Boeing, and the Army Air Corps Technical Division descended on bases in England, armed with pressure gauges, X-ray equipment, and hundreds of pages of technical specifications. They tested everything. They couldn't find the cause, but they could describe the symptoms with maddening precision. The hydraulic fluid pressure would drop from normal operating range, around 1,500 psi, to 0 in approximately 8 to 12 seconds. There was no gradual decline, no warning. System pressure would read normal, then catastrophically fail. The fluid reservoirs were always full after crashes, ruling out leaks. The pumps showed no damage. It was as if something was blocking the system entirely, but inspections revealed no obstructions. The engineers were baffled. Pilots were terrified, and the casualties mounted. Frank Kowalski knew nothing about any of this when he climbed aboard Memphis Belle II on the morning of March 14th. He was a replacement crew member, a waist gunner and assistant flight engineer with exactly 4 combat missions under his belt. He'd grown up fixing John Deere tractors on a farm outside of Omaha, joined the Army Air Corps the day after his 18th birthday, and discovered he had an almost supernatural ability to understand how mechanical things worked. His instructors at technical school said he could see inside machines, diagnose problems by sound, and feel that other mechanics needed instruments to detect. But Kowalski didn't think of himself as anything special. He just liked figuring out how things worked, and more importantly, how to make them work when they broke. The mission that day was a raid on ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany. It was the kind of mission crews dreaded, a long flight over heavily defended territory, against targets the Luftwaffe would defend fanatically. Memphis Belle II flew in the number 4 position of the lead squadron, carrying 4,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs and a crew of 10 men, most of whom had known each other for less than 3 weeks. The raid itself went as badly as expected. German fighters swarmed the formation before they even reached the target. Flak over Schweinfurt was the heaviest Kowalski had ever seen, filling the sky with black bursts that rocked the aircraft and sent shrapnel tearing through aluminum skin. Memphis Belle II took hits in the number 3 engine, the radio compartment, and the tail section. The number 3 engine had to be feathered. Its propeller stopped and turned edge-on to reduce drag. They dropped their bombs through the smoke and fire below, turned for home on 3 engines, and began the long flight back to England with 100 other battered bombers. They made it across the channel. They could see the green fields of East Anglia. The pilot, Lieutenant James Hargrove, began his descent toward RAF Bassingbourn, running through the pre-landing checklist with his co-pilot. Landing gear down and locked. Fuel mixture rich. Throttles back. Everything normal. They were 3 minutes from touchdown when Hargrove reached for the flap control. Nothing happened. He tried again, pushing the lever forward to extend the flaps that would slow the aircraft for landing. The lever moved freely, but the flaps didn't budge. Hargrove felt a cold spike of fear. "Hydraulic pressure?" he called. The co-pilot checked the gauge. "0, he reported, his voice tight. "We've got nothing." It was the failure they'd all heard about, the one that had killed so many crews. Without hydraulics, they couldn't control their flaps or brakes. Landing a B-17 without flaps meant coming in dangerously fast. Too fast for the runway at Bassingbourn. And without brakes, they'd never stop anyway. They'd roll off the end of the runway at 70 miles per hour and cartwheel across the countryside. If they were very lucky, they'd die quickly when the fuel tanks exploded. Hargrove made his decision in seconds. "Prepare to bail out," he ordered. "We're not landing this bird." The crew began clipping on parachutes, preparing to jump. They had maybe 2 minutes before Hargrove would have to turn away from the base, gain altitude, and give the order to abandon the aircraft. 10 men would jump into the English countryside. Memphis Belle II, which had survived 37 combat missions, would crash empty into some farmer's field. But Frank Kowalski wasn't clipping on his parachute. He was thinking about the hydraulic system, about what could cause a complete pressure failure with no warning, no leak, and no visible damage. He'd helped repair dozens of hydraulic systems on tractors and farm equipment back home. Hydraulic systems were simple, really, just fluid under pressure moving through lines and cylinders to create mechanical force. If pressure dropped to 0 instantly, something had to be blocking the system completely. But what could block every line simultaneously? Then he remembered something. Cold. They'd been at 25,000 feet for hours, in temperatures 40 degrees below 0. Now they were descending into warmer air. What happened to moisture when temperature changed rapidly? Condensed. And if there was even a tiny amount of water contamination in the hydraulic fluid, at 25,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures, it could freeze into ice crystals. Small crystals suspended in the fluid wouldn't block anything at high altitude, but during descent, as the temperature warmed, those crystals would melt, and if they were near a restriction point, a valve, a filter, anywhere the fluid had to pass through a small opening, they could refreeze into a solid ice plug when they hit a cold metal surface. It was just a theory. Kowalski had no proof, but it felt right. He'd seen something similar in tractor hydraulics during Nebraska winters, though never this severe. And if he was right, the solution was simple. Not easy, but simple. Heat the restriction point, melt the ice, restore flow. "Give me 60 seconds, Kowalski shouted to the pilot. He didn't wait for permission. He yanked open his footlocker and grabbed the bent coat hanger he'd been meaning to throw away for weeks. The coat hanger was steel wire, maybe 16 inches long. He straightened it against the floor with his boot, then wrapped one end around the handle of a metal flashlight to create a handle he could grip. The other end he left straight, a thin probe of wire. The hydraulic system's main distribution valve was accessible through a maintenance panel behind the co-pilot's seat. Kowalski had inspected it during pre-flight checks. He tore the panel open, exposing a maze of steel lines, valves, and fittings. The distribution valve was about the size of a coffee can, with 4 inlet lines and 6 outlet lines. If ice was blocking the system, it would be right there at the point where fluid flow was most restricted. But how do you heat a valve that's buried in a mass of other components, in a freezing aircraft with no power tools and no time? Kowalski looked at the wire in his hand. Steel wire, electrical conductor. And Memphis Belle II still had 3 working engines, which meant 3 working generators, which meant electrical power. He crawled to the nearest power outlet, a 24-volt DC socket used for auxiliary equipment. He took the straightened coat hanger, wrapped the flashlight handle end in a torn piece of cloth from his jacket to insulate it, then jammed the straight end directly against the hydraulic distribution valve body. "Turn off everything electrical," he shouted. "Everything." I need all the power to the auxiliary circuits. The pilot didn't understand what Kowalski was doing, but he was out of options. He killed every electrical system except the essential flight instruments. Kowalski took a deep breath, said a prayer to a god he wasn't sure he believed in, and touched his makeshift wire probe to the 24-volt power socket. The wire began to heat immediately. It wasn't much, maybe a few hundred degrees at most, but it was concentrated right against the valve body. Kowalski held it there, feeling the wire grow hot in his insulated hand, watching the valve, praying that his theory was right and that he wasn't about to electrocute himself or start a fire in a fuel-soaked aircraft. 30 seconds passed. 40. "We're out of time," Hargrove called from the cockpit. "I have to turn away." 5 more seconds. Kowalski shouted back. He pressed the wire harder against the valve, feeling sweat run down his face despite the cold. Then he heard it. A click. A tiny, almost imperceptible click from somewhere deep in the valve assembly. He pulled the wire away and scrambled to the cockpit. "Try it now." Hargrove reached for the flap control lever with no hope in his heart. He pushed it forward. The flaps extended. The hydraulic pressure gauge leaped from 0 to 1,500 psi. In the tail, the gunner reported that the rudder and elevator surfaces had full control authority again. They had hydraulics. The system was working perfectly. Hargrove landed Memphis Belle II 3 minutes later, using full flaps and normal braking. The landing was smooth, routine, unremarkable. Only the crew knew how close they'd come to disaster. Only Kowalski understood what had happened. He reported his theory and his fix to the maintenance officer that evening. The officer was skeptical but desperate. They'd lost another B-17 to hydraulic failure just 2 days earlier. He ordered immediate testing. Maintenance crews began inspecting hydraulic fluid samples under microscopes, looking for water contamination. They found it tiny amounts, less than 0.5% by volume, but enough. At high altitude, in extreme cold, with the right conditions, it was freezing into ice crystals. During descent, those crystals were collecting at restriction points and forming solid ice plugs. The MIT engineers were recalled. They confirmed Kowalski's theory within 48 hours and were reportedly furious that a teenage mechanic with a high school education had solved in 60 seconds what they'd failed to identify in 3 months of investigation. The contamination source was traced to condensation in fuel tanks that shared heating systems with hydraulic reservoirs. A design flaw no one had noticed because it only manifested under specific operational conditions unique to high-altitude bomber operations in European weather. But identifying the problem was only half the solution. The long-term fix required redesigning fuel and hydraulic systems, installing better filtration, and adding heating elements to prevent ice formation. That would take months. In the meantime, bombers were still flying combat missions, still descending from freezing altitudes, still at risk of catastrophic hydraulic failure. Kowalski's coat hanger trick became the interim solution. Within a week, every heavy bomber crew in England had been trained in the technique. The official procedure was slightly more sophisticated than Kowalski's improvised version. It used a proper heating element instead of a coat hanger, and specific protocols for applying heat to hydraulic components. But the principle was identical. Heat the valve, melt the ice, restore hydraulics. The Air Corps issued an Emergency Technical Order 201-20EG-2-12, Emergency Hydraulic System De-icing Procedure for High-Altitude Operations, that detailed the technique. Kowalski's name appeared in the acknowledgments. He was promoted to Technical Sergeant and awarded the Soldier's Medal for saving his crew. The citation described his extraordinary initiative and technical skill under life-threatening conditions. But the real measure of Kowalski's contribution came in the statistics. After implementation of the emergency de-icing procedure, hydraulic-related landing failures in B-17s dropped to near zero. Between March 1944 and the end of the war in Europe, the technique was successfully employed an estimated 347 times, saving approximately 300 aircraft and 3,000 aircrew lives. The long-term engineering fixes were eventually implemented: better fluid filtration, heated hydraulic lines, improved reservoir designs, but they took until late 1944 to roll out across the entire bomber fleet. Kowalski survived the war, flew 28 more combat missions, and returned to Nebraska in 1945 with a chest full of medals and no particular desire to talk about them. He took over his father's farm, married his high school sweetheart, and raised 4 children. He fixed tractors, helped his neighbors with mechanical problems, and occasionally told the story of the coat hanger to his grandchildren, who never quite believed it was true. The Air Force didn't forget. As hydraulic systems grew more complex in jet aircraft, the fundamental principle of Kowalski's emergency fix remained relevant. Ice contamination in hydraulic systems continued to be a concern in high-altitude operations. The emergency de-icing procedures evolved, but they traced their lineage directly to Technical Order 01-20G2-12 and a Nebraska farm kid with a coat hanger. When the Air Force updated its Emergency Procedures Manual in 1987, incorporating lessons learned from decades of jet operations, a footnote on page 247 read, "Emergency hydraulic de-icing protocols derived from field techniques developed by T/SGT Frank Kowalski, USAC, March 1944. When the last B-52H was retired from active service in a ceremony at Barksdale Air Force Base in 2023, the presiding general mentioned Kowalski by name in his remarks, noting that emergency procedures developed 80 years earlier by an enlisted mechanic were still saving lives in aircraft. Frank Kowalski died in 2008 at the age of 83, surrounded by family on the same farm where he'd grown up. His obituary in the Omaha World Herald mentioned his military service but didn't explain the significance of his wartime innovation. Most of his neighbors knew him as a good farmer and a skilled mechanic who could fix anything. Few knew that a bent coat hanger and 60 seconds of improvised genius had changed Air Force protocol forever and saved thousands of lives. The coat hanger itself, the actual piece of wire Kowalski used that day in 1944, was lost to history. He probably tossed it in the trash after landing, having no idea that his desperate improvisation would become legendary. But somewhere in the archives at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, there's a copy of Technical Order 01-20G2-12, dated March 1944, describing in precise technical language how to save a dying aircraft with nothing but heat, wire, and the kind of practical ingenuity that no engineering degree can teach. That document is Kowalski's real monument, proof that sometimes the best solutions come not from laboratories and advanced degrees, but from young men under pressure who refuse to give up and who understand, in their bones and blood, how things actually work. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. The official investigation that followed Kowalski's emergency repair revealed just how close the Army Air Corps had come to a catastrophic crisis. Captain Robert Hernandez, the lead MIT engineer who had spent 3 months chasing the hydraulic phantom, later admitted in his official report that his team had actually considered water contamination early in their investigation but dismissed it because the amounts seemed too negligible to cause system failure. They'd been looking for dramatic causes, major design flaws, sabotage, metal fatigue, and had overlooked the simple physics of phase change at altitude. Hernandez wrote that Kowalski's solution was embarrassingly elegant, and noted that the sergeant's practical field experience proved more valuable than our collective advanced degrees. But the MIT team's embarrassment turned to genuine respect when they began testing Kowalski's theory under laboratory conditions. They discovered the problem was far more complex than anyone had realized. The water contamination wasn't entering the system from a single source but from multiple vectors. Condensation in fuel tanks during rapid altitude changes, moisture in replacement hydraulic fluid that had been stored in unheated warehouses in the damp English climate, and even humidity absorbed through rubber seals and gaskets. The amounts were tiny, sometimes less than 0.3%, but at 25,000 feet where temperatures hovered around -40 degrees Fahrenheit, even microscopic water droplets would crystallize. The real genius of Kowalski's accidental discovery was understanding that the ice didn't cause problems at altitude. The crystals remained suspended in the thick hydraulic fluid, flowing harmlessly through the system. The catastrophic failure only occurred during descent when the aircraft dropped into warmer air. The temperature gradient caused the ice crystals to begin melting, and as they did, they migrated toward the coldest points in the system, typically the metal valve bodies and junction points that had the greatest thermal mass and stayed cold longest. There, the partially melted ice would refreeze into solid plugs, blocking fluid flow completely within seconds. The engineers calculated that the temperature range where this phenomenon occurred was remarkably narrow, between -10 and +15 degrees Fahrenheit. Above that range, the ice melted completely and dispersed. Below it, the crystals stayed suspended. But in that 25-degree window, which happened to correspond exactly to the altitude range where pilots began their final approach, between 3,000 and 8,000 feet, the conditions were perfect for ice plug formation. It was a deadly coincidence of physics, engineering, and operational procedure. Training crews in Kowalski's emergency technique proved more challenging than anyone anticipated. The official procedure required the crew's flight engineer to heat the hydraulic distribution valve using a specially designed heating element that plugged into the aircraft's 24-volt electrical system. Simple enough in theory. But in practice, the valve was often difficult to access in the chaos of an emergency. The heating element had to be applied to exactly the right spot, and the engineer had to maintain contact for at least 30 to 45 seconds while the pilots fought to keep a crippled bomber under control. Master Sergeant William Chun, who became the primary instructor for the emergency procedure at RAF Bassingbourn, developed a training program that used a mock-up B-17 fuselage section. He would fill the hydraulic system with ice water, then time how fast student engineers could locate the valve, apply the heating element, and restore pressure. The first classes averaged 4 minutes, far too long for a real emergency. Chun drilled his students relentlessly, running them through the procedure dozens of times until they could do it blindfolded in under 90 seconds. He also taught them Kowalski's original improvised method with wire and electrical current as a backup, just in case the official heating element failed or was lost. The first documented successful use of the procedure after Kowalski's original fix came on March 23, 1944, when a B-17 named Devil's Daughter experienced hydraulic failure on approach to RAF Thaley. Flight engineer Staff Sergeant James Morton had been through Chen's training just 4 days earlier. When the hydraulic pressure dropped to 0 at 4,000 feet, Morton didn't panic. He went straight to the distribution valve, applied the heating element, and restored full pressure in 58 seconds. The pilot, Lieutenant Edward Brooks, later said he'd already given the order to bail out when he felt the flap controls come back to life in his hands. Morton's successful application of the procedure was cited in the official training manual as proof the technique worked under actual emergency conditions. By April 1944, the emergency de-icing procedure had been implemented across all heavy bomber groups in the European theater. The Army Air Corps also rushed to develop longer-term engineering solutions. Boeing engineers designed heated hydraulic lines that used waste heat from the engines to keep fluid temperatures above freezing. New filtration systems were developed to remove water contamination before it could enter the hydraulic system. Maintenance protocols were revised to require testing hydraulic fluid for water content before every mission. Fluid storage procedures were changed to prevent condensation in supply tanks. But these engineering fixes took months to design, test, manufacture, and install across hundreds of aircraft. In the meantime, Kowalski's emergency procedure was the only thing standing between flight crews and catastrophic failure. Between March and August 1944, the technique was successfully employed 73 times in the European theater alone. Pacific theater bomber groups, operating B-29 superfortresses at even higher altitudes, adopted the procedure in May 1944 and credited it with saving at least 40 aircraft during high-altitude missions over Japan. The human cost of the delay in solving the hydraulic crisis became clear when the final casualty reports were compiled. Before Kowalski's fix, the hydraulic failure problem had claimed 41 aircraft and 312 lives. The number was higher than initially reported because some crashes had been attributed to other causes before the pattern was recognized. After implementation of the emergency procedure, not a single aircraft was lost to hydraulic ice blockage for the remainder of the war in Europe. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Kowalski himself became something of a reluctant celebrity among bomber crews. Other mechanics sought him out for advice on difficult repair problems. Pilots who'd heard the story wanted to shake his hand. He was offered a commission as a warrant officer, which he declined, saying he preferred working with his hands to pushing papers. When a reporter from Stars and Stripes tried to interview him for a feature story, Kowalski gave terse, uncomfortable answers and finally said, "I just did what anybody would have done. I got lucky, that's all." The reporter noted that Kowalski seemed genuinely baffled by the attention and far more interested in discussing a carburetor problem he was working on. What Kowalski never told the reporter, but later admitted to his wife decades after the war, was that he'd been terrified that day on Memphis Belle II. He'd had no idea if his theory was correct. The coat hanger trick could easily have failed, could have electrocuted him, could have started a fire. He'd gambled everything on intuition and desperation. The fact that it worked, he said, still amazed him 50 years later. He'd just been a scared kid who didn't want to die and figured he might as well try something, anything, rather than give up. That it became official Air Force protocol seemed absurd to him, like the universe playing an elaborate joke.